Morning. Uh, my talk today is on ordinary views about birth and death. In terms of full disclosure, any view I offer today is an ordinary view, so keep that in mind. A couple of things got me thinking about this. Of course, one of them is the pandemic. It's weighed pretty heavily on all of us. I know some people in this community have lost people to COVID-19. I'm sure that everyone has been worried about their family and their friends, and worried about people they don't know. And it's probably fair to say that we've all had a few opportunities to think about our own death, our own vulnerability to COVID-19. The other reason I chose this topic is that in February, actually early February, usually the first week or so is a time when some Buddhist communities commemorate the Buddha's entering nirvana, which means his death. It's usually early in the month, probably the 8th or the 15th, depending on the community. Just like in April or May, there's commemoration of his birth. It's early in the month, but different communities seem to choose different months. And of course, in early December is the commemoration of his enlightenment, the time of the Rohatsu Sesshin. All of you who have set sesshin know the part of the meal chant or sutra that goes like this. Buddha was born at Lumbini, enlightened at Bodhagaya, taught at Varanasi, entered nirvana at Kusinagara. And that reflects on, obviously, his birth, his extraordinary life, and then his death. And entering nirvana is really just language to describe his death. Usually it's used to signify someone who's held in high regard in the Buddhist communities. Just like if someone's a Taoist held in high regard, people will say that they went off to join the immortals, or a Christian might go to walk with Jesus. But it kind of begs the question, what is nirvana? And if you do some research on it, Google it, whatever you do, you're going to come up with a number of different opinions. The most interesting little treatise about this I ran across was a discussion, someone saying, well, didn't the Buddha enter nirvana when he became enlightened? And the counter is, well, yeah, but then that must have been spiritual nirvana, and then he entered physical nirvana when he died, which is, I think, a semi-interesting intellectual discourse, but I don't know that it has a lot of meaning. And I can tell you that I really couldn't tell you what nirvana is, other than what it's not. And it's not something that is bound by ordinary views, certainly our views about it. It's not a place, not a state of mind. It's just free of ordinary views. Though I think we probably all might have ideas about what entering nirvana might mean. I'll just mention a little bit about the story of the historical Buddha's death. And that's told pretty consistently. The day that he died, he got up as he usually did, put on his begging robe, took his bowl, and went out into the neighborhood around where he was staying, which was at that point, obviously in a grove of trees near Kusinagara. He would pick 7 homes to ask for food, and whatever. And it wasn't a situation he distinguished a rich home versus a poor home. It just was any 7 homes he ran across, whatever they gave him, he would take back to where he was staying, and that would be his meal for that day. And on that particular day, he became extremely ill shortly after he ate. And although no one really knows what happened, the speculation is that it was either severe food poisoning or possibly a mesenteric infarction or some kind of consumption-based, meaning consuming food-based illness. And of course, he knew he was dying, and all the people around him, which were his followers, his disciples, some were his relatives, people who had been with him for decades. They all knew that he was dying. And so when you read these stories, you'll find that there's some teachings that are offered. And this is one that I chose just because I think it has great meaning. And again, if you have the situation, you have a man who's dying, who's been a teacher to all of the people with him. And I'm sure they have very close relationships. So everyone was feeling grief, sadness. And one of the followers, and different names are attached to the person who asked this question. It really doesn't matter who asked it, but they asked the Buddha not to die or not to enter nirvana. They asked him to continue to turn the wheel of the Dharma. And this is his response. Again, this is the Buddha on the day of his death. And I think if you follow the stories about it, a very painful death, this is how he responded. I have been among you for 49 years, and yet I have not spoken a single word. You asked me to continue turning the wheel of Dharma, but have I, in fact, ever turned the wheel of Dharma? Listen to my gatha. From the time I found the pass, and that would have been the Bodh Gaya, until I reached the Vasi River, which is where he lay dying, at Kusinagara. Between one place and the other, I spoke not a single word. I think, again, very powerful teaching. For the purposes of my talk, I think it does suggest that he's telling his followers not to hold on to any ordinary views about him or about the teachings. It's a reminder of something you've probably heard a number of times if you've been around Dharma field, which is it's the teaching, not the teaching. It's what the teachings point to that we need to attend to. And I think also probably fair to say that that was the Buddha encouraging his followers to become teachers or to continue teaching, which of course many of them did, and then they had the same transmission from one teacher to another up to the current day. So I'll talk a little bit more about ordinary views. We all have them. I think we have particularly strong views about issues of death, at least most everyone I talk to does. It's a natural part of our lives. Our views about birth and death come from things we've heard or didn't hear in our family of origin, meaning the family we grew up in. It had to do with religious training and experience, with secular education. Clearly has something to do with experiences we've had with the death of others, our family, our friends. Has to do with being around others, either at or near the time of their death. All of these circumstances, which are different for each one of us, we all have our own set of circumstances, contribute to the formation of ordinary views about issues of birth and death. Certainly close association with someone who's dying will trigger a reflection on our views. I'm going to talk just briefly about an opportunity I've had in the past few years. For those who know me, I'm a retired psychologist, so I don't really have to work for money, but among other things I do, one of them is that I do volunteer work with the hospice program. I'm part of that palliative care team, in which my role is to provide psychological and emotional support. And the patients in this particular program are all military veterans, either Vietnam era and some Korean War veterans. And they're all of them have been living in congregate care facilities, nursing homes, assisted living situations. Of course, this was in person until about a year ago when the pandemic hit, and now it's done remotely. Zoom or Microsoft version of Zoom or on the phone, which is certainly much less intimate for these veterans and also for the families who I talk to at times, but we make do with what we have. One of the things that will come up in a lot of these conversations, particularly people I've got to know fairly well, is their views about what will happen after they die. It's been, with one exception, all people who hold Christian views, and so, they either are comforted by that view or they're not. Those people who think they follow the teachings of Jesus and behave during their life think they're going to have a positive experience after they die, and those who maybe didn't follow it so closely are less certain about what's going to happen. And one of the things that actually comes up more often than I thought it would is people asking me what my views are. Usually it's a question, something along the lines of, what church do you go to? And my response is always the same. It's just a the minimal description of a meditation practice. And this gets a range of responses. One response is kind of that look you get like, we've got a live one here, they think it's kind of a strange view. And sometimes it's just curiosity, and we'll have a conversation about what it might mean. Probably the most heartfelt response is people will say to me, even though this might sound a bit judgmental, they'll say, well, I'm going to pray for you, which I think is a true expression of their faith, their belief. One of the conversations that I remember most vividly is one with a Korean War veteran, a guy in his late 80s, really kind of a crusty old guy, a lot of difficulties in his life, including we had two sons. Neither one would visit him, even though he was dying and he was lived close by. He had one daughter who saw him, and that was part of what I was trying to help him with. And he really didn't talk much about his views about what would happen after death. But at one point he did ask me. I don't remember exactly what he said, what the question was, but I gave him that kind of short response about a meditation practice. And he said to me, he said, son, the people at my church would say that you're going to burn in hell. And I said, well, I said, Dave, I'm someone who's open to all options, but, burning in hell is kind of low on that list of options. And we had a little bit of a laugh about that. And then he became very serious. And this was the only time he talked about his views about what would happen after he died. He said, if you end up there, can you look me up? I'll need someone to talk to. I'm afraid I'm going to be lonely. And that reflects, I think, his views about what would happen after he died, and also the loneliness he was experiencing as he was moving towards his own death. And I told him what I tell anyone who has that view. I said, if you and I end up in hell because we made a few mistakes, we're not going to be lonely. We're going to have lots of company. And he said, with some expletives, that I was probably right. But anyway, what I do appreciate about working in the hospice program, volunteering in the hospice program, is the opportunity to talk with people about their views, but also it causes me to reflect on my views about death. It reminds me to have great respect for other people's views, although how much I respect the view that I'm going to burn in hell is up for debate. But you know what I mean. Everyone has the views, and you have to be very careful about how they talk about it. So now I'm going to review just a few Buddhist teachings about death. Actually, about birth and death, and I'll keep it short. And also, you have to remember that we don't want to attach any ordinary views to these teachings. I think it's fair that most of us, most people, have had questions about existence. Where did I come from? What's going to happen after I die? Most theistic religions, certainly the Abrahamic religions, offer an answer, which is you were created by God. You live your life, and when you die, you return to God, or maybe to some other destination. And that can be pretty comforting. But if we don't hold that, if we believe that life really is an existence that starts at birth, runs a while, and then ends at death, we can, we can have a lot of suffering. We think that we become nothing. If we die, we become nothing. We have that fear of annihilation. And knew that there was nothing that became something that became nothing. But that's really not what the Buddha taught. If I can sidestep just a little bit, it's really not what science teaches us either. Even those of us who have just a rudimentary knowledge of science, we know that the most brilliant scientific mind with the most advanced techniques cannot create something from nothing. They can change the structure of something and make it into something else, but it's never nothing to something. And on the other end, science can't change something to nothing. They can dramatically alter the nature of something, but it's always something. But that's science. Back to what Buddhist teachings are. Obviously, the Buddha taught a very different understanding. He taught an understanding that's different from our ordinary views. He taught that ordinary views about birth and death are just that. They're just ordinary views. Buddhist teachings really tell us that when conditions are sufficient, we manifest. Although maybe it's better to say what appears to be us manifest. But then when conditions no longer are sufficient, we no longer manifest. This is not a teaching of ordinary view. It doesn't mean that we weren't born. It doesn't mean that we don't exist. It doesn't mean that we won't die or that we do die. It just means that our ordinary views about these issues are just ordinary, and we have to be careful to not attach to them. I think if you review some Buddhist teachings, you'll find a statement that goes like this: what does not exist cannot come into existence, and what exists cannot cease to exist. And this is a teaching, I think, to let go of our ordinary views about these matters about birth and death. It's a teaching that the conditions of our existence, the conditions of birth and death, are always changing, always transforming. There's transformation at the moment of your birth. There's transformation every moment until you die, and there's transformation beyond that. It's the teaching about impermanence. Certainly our ordinary views about these things change, but the reality of it doesn't change. The Buddha taught that reality is not conditioned by birth, it's not conditioned by death, it's not conditioned by being or non-being, not conditioned by views of same or different, not conditioned by views of self or annihilation of self. It's just as it is. It's empty of all ordinary views, including our views about birth and death. Sometimes when we read these teachings or listen to people talk about these teachings, we think that there's a contradiction there, that some of the Buddhist teachings on birth and death contradict other ones, such as, if you think of the things I just mentioned, briefly mentioned, you might think that that contradicts the teaching that everyone is of a nature to grow old, to become ill, and to die. The teaching that we can't escape death. And I would say that most of us don't really want to escape death. We just want to control the timing and the circumstances of our death. I'd say, good luck with that. It's probably not going to happen. But none of these teachings are contradictory. The teachings only say don't hold on to your particular or ordinary views about these matters. That's the way that you might be able to see what reality is. Another thing we know about the teachings of the Buddha is that he was persistently pointing out, I'm just looking out at how beautiful the snowfall is, sorry. He's persistently pointing out the unconditioned, beginningless, endless nature of reality, including our existence, including his existence. He would ask his followers to refer to him, and he would refer to himself as Tathagata, which variable translations on that, one who thus comes, one who thus goes, one who comes in suchness, one who goes in suchness. And it wasn't that he referred to himself as the Tathagata, but just as Tathagata. But it's not a title of honor or distinction, it's actually a title of non-distinction. A title of non-duality, non-differentiation. It's a teaching that all beings, including the historical Buddha, arise to suchness and live in reality. That we all exist in this, for lack of better words, you might call it non-conceptual reality. So that's my brief talk about Buddhist teachings, and I think there's great merit in studying those teachings, but we have to be very careful that we don't attach ordinary views to it. And as I said, all the views that I attach to that are ordinary views, meaning they're from a perspective. They don't necessarily contain, they absolutely do not contain the whole of the teachings. We just have to be careful about how we think about these things. Quite a few Buddhist teachings on views. We're all probably familiar with the teaching called right view, which is not ordinary or particular view. It's neither right versus wrong view, such as in a moral situation, or correct or incorrect, it's a mathematical situation. Right view simply means wholesome view, the view of the whole. It's freedom from any and all ordinary views or particular views. There's no vantage point. It's just a view of the whole. And as we know, this is the on the path to reduce suffering. You'll also find teachings on views in some of the larger sutras, or more prominent sutras, which in my case means the ones that I'm familiar with. And there's actually a kind of historical timeline on how these teachings were offered. And you'll come across this if you read some of the writings by people I would call Buddhist historians, not what they call themselves, but the people who made a point of studying the original transcripts, which would have been Sanskrit, which was written long after the Buddha passed, and also studied the Chinese interpretations or transcripts of the sutras when Buddhism came to China. And most of these would be the Shan Buddhism versions of the transcripts, and then those are the ones that came to Japan and became Zen Buddhism. These are people like Bill Porter, who we know as Red Pine, very prolific researcher and writer. Some of us remember when he came to Dharma Field and gave a talk a number of years ago. Or David Hinton, who does kind of the same thing. And there are others, but they all really come up with the same sequence of teachings. And it makes sense to me. This is how it goes. Well, the Buddha, at the time of his awakening, taught emptiness. And this was, the heart of those teachings. He taught emptiness of the teachings, emptiness of emptiness, emptiness of everything. And this eventually became known as the Heart Suture. At some point, it took that form. And again, if you follow the storyline, there are a number of people who suggest that the Buddha noticed that his followers were struggling with the teaching on emptiness. What those struggles were probably the same struggles that we have, or I have. We form views about it, we have ideas about it, we conceptualize it. Think emptiness is either like something or not like something. And so we are not really seeing the teaching. And so in response to seeing these struggles, the Buddha then offered the teachings on non-attachment to views, which are present in a number of teachings, but are most prominently seen in what we now know as the Diamond Suture. If you look at the standard English translation of the Diamond Suture, it's about 8,000 words. It's pretty substantial volume. But you can also find it in the Diamond Suture, 10,000 lines, 25,000 lines, 100,000 lines, maybe more. But they all really say the same thing. And that is non-attachment to view. There's another statement about views that is attributed to the historical Buddha that you'll find in the Ratnakuta Sutra, which is a collection of Mahayana Buddhist sutras, also called the accumulation of jewels. And of course, there's various translations of this as well, because anyone who does a translation will use their own language in it. And this is a version of it that is presented by Reverend Nat Han. And those of you who have heard him speak or read his many writings, you'll know that he frequently uses the term notion to describe ordinary views or particular views or concepts. And that's what's used in this statement attributed to the historical Buddha. I'll just read it to you. If you are caught by the notion of being and non-being, then the notion of emptiness can help you to get free. But if you are caught by the notion of emptiness, there's no hope. Pretty powerful statement, pretty simple statement. And it's no more complicated than saying, well, you know, a lot of your views and a lot of your notions are helpful. But if you grasp onto those views, including those views about the teachings, in this case, the teaching on emptiness, it's not going to work out all that well. It's, I think, a very simple statement, and very much to the heart of the matter. But if you study all of the Buddha's teachings on non-attachment to views, and I certainly haven't done that, but I've done a lot of reading on it, you won't find anything that says views are wrong or they should be banished. You won't find statements that views are right either. They just say, you know, views are views. It points out, you know, how limited those views are and how limiting they are. In the Diamond Sutra, if you read that, you see the Buddha teaching not to be bound by views and concepts. Teaching that all of us, all beings are enlightened, but our delusions, for the sake of this talk, our attachment to ordinary views keep us from realizing that fact. And we all have ordinary views. I mean, that's just a given, and we shouldn't be upset about that. It's certainly a normal aspect of our day-to-day life. We couldn't really run our lives unless we held the views. Some of them, those views are probably reasonable, thoughtful views. Some of them maybe not so reasonable. And in that sense, they're helpful, but they also can be helpful in this practice. Now, I think it's fair to say that none of us would have taken up the meditation practice if we didn't at some point hold the view that there was something to gain. It wouldn't make any sense. People don't start things unless there's something to gain from it. even though the gain is not so obvious to others. But all of us had an idea that this would be helpful to us somehow, that we would gain something. And that brought us to the practice. Of course, for those of us who hang on to that view that there's something to gain, and it doesn't matter what we thought we would gain, there's all kinds of possibilities, and that the thought of what we would gain probably changes. But if we hold on to that gain, we're in for a lot of unnecessary suffering. We'll be stuck on the view of we want to gain something. But if we can recognize that view as for what it is, an ordinary view, a view that's been helpful, but maybe no longer all that helpful, and give it up, then we can have some freedom. And we can realize that there's nothing to gain from this practice. We can't gain what we already have. And when we let go of the view that we need to gain something, then we might be able to recognize what is already there. Another common view that people have is that everything has a beginning and an end. And that's true of most things in our probably everything in our day-to-day life. If we want to have a profession of some kind, we might say, I want to be an electrician, so I'll go to school, do all the training, starts at some point, it ends at some point. You become an electrician. Or if you're reading a book, it has a beginning and an end. Now this talk has a beginning. Anyone who's wondering, it will have an end. That will come up here shortly. And that is just a normal part of life. And we can bring that to this practice as well. All of us can look back and see, maybe vaguely, we can see, when this practice started for us, when we decided, for any number of reasons, to take up a meditation practice. But when we bring the concept of beginning and end of that view into this practice, then we run into trouble again, because we're looking for an end. We're looking for something to get finished, something to get accomplished. Kind of, again, common human endeavor. Let's get this over with. Let's get it done. And so you bring in, particularly, a view that there's something to gain, and there's a beginning and an end to that gaining, you're just going to have a lot of frustration. The key is to let go of that view. What happens if you let go of that view? You're freed from it. You don't have to suffer anymore about things not ending. You don't have to be self-critical. You don't have to say, well, damn it, I should have gotten there by now. And I think you have a greater opportunity to just, for lack of better words, let your practice deepen. So then the question comes up, how do we recognize what ordinary views are, and how do we not attach to them? Certainly, when you think about our views of all kinds, they're all ordinary, they're all particular, they all have some limitations. We need to apply a lot of critical thinking. And that's important in this practice, to wholeheartedly think about your involvement in the practice. But you can't think your way out of having views. You can break them down, you can do all kinds of processes to try to understand if something is an ordinary view or it's not an ordinary view. And I've done it, we've all probably done it. But in the end, you'll come to the conclusion that all your views are ordinary views. All the views that you attach to, that you grasp onto, that you hold on to, and I'll say particular views about the meditation practice are just set, they're ordinary views. And so then if you follow the teachings, it's just let go of those views. Not to throw them away, not to be overly disturbed by them, not to be agitated, just let go of them. And they won't be as limiting as they were, to recognize them for what they are. And the next question is, well, how do you what's the process for letting go of the view, any view that we hold? It's not easy because most of the views we hold are beliefs. They're deeply rooted in all kinds of things. And even if we intellectually recognize them for what they are, we may have difficulty just letting go of them. And I really can't tell anyone how to do that, but I do know that if we listen to the instructions on meditation, and of course, meditation is not confined to sitting on a cushion, but if we listen to them, we might find some help. You know, all of us, when we're sitting meditation, have thoughts that arise. Everyone does. At least everyone I've talked to says that they do. And sometimes they're pleasant thoughts or emotions, and you might spend your time on the cushion in this nice daydream or fantasy. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but it happens. Or they might be troubling emotions or troubling thoughts, and you spend the time agitated and trying to solve the problem. And again, there's nothing right or wrong about that. But if you listen to the instructions on meditation, which I think all of us have heard a number of times, when those thoughts arise, we see them for what they are. They're just wrinkles of our own mind. They're just thoughts. And if we don't attach to them, and if we don't attend to them, they will pass. And that gives us the opportunity to experience just sitting on the meditation cushion. I think the same process applies to non-attachment to ordinary views. If we see them for what they are, and like I said, every view that floats up in my mind, ultimately I see as an ordinary view. I just don't attach to it. That's the teaching. Sounds simple. It is very simple. It's very difficult. It requires great diligence. But that's the important thing about all views, including views about birth and death. And I think for most people, views about death are some of the most troubling and difficult views to manage. It's a view that arises in us the most fearfulness, the most anxiety. But the teachings, again, the Buddhist teachings are not to be troubled by ordinary views and delusions. Just recognize them and go on with your life. So I'm going to just read one more teaching to kind of end my talk. This is a teaching offered by a Korean monk. His name is Tae Nang. Lived in the 16th and 17th century. He was the founder of one of the sects of Korean Buddhism. And this is a commentary on the Diamond Suture, or part of his commentary on the Diamond Suture. And I'll just read it and then I'll be done. This is what he said. Delusion is the root of enlightenment. If someone uses this for their practice, it can become the means for transcending the world. The lotus does not grow in high places. It only blooms in muddy water. Delusion doesn't injure the enlightened mind. So too, smoke and clouds obscure the sun and moon without injuring them. If a jewel is dropped into the mud, neither is the jewel injured. Don't concern yourself with the clouds of delusion. Concentrate on the enlightened mind. And I think a beautifully written commentary on all of these issues. So with that, I will be quiet. And if anyone has any questions or comments, we can do that.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Could you please repeat the commentary? The audio was breaking up for me.
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
That. And this is by a man whose name is Tae Nang. Delusion is the root of enlightenment. If someone uses this for their practice, it can become the means for transcending the world. The lotus does not grow in high places. It only blooms in muddy water. Delusion doesn't injure the enlightened mind. So too, smoke and clouds obscure the sun and moon without injuring them. If a jewel is dropped into the mud, neither is the jewel injured. Don't concern yourself with clouds of delusion. Concentrate on the enlightened mind. Beautiful. Thank you.